Thanks, Guya. Nice to present here. This is joint work with Shireen Joshi, who is where? Hiding there, and Nishta Kochar, who's hiding there. So we're all here. Okay. Okay, so, you know, if you talk about gender in India, in South Asia actually, you cannot escape its relationship with caste. Yeah, because caste is associated with patriarchy and therefore associated with gender inequality. And any piece of work on gender in India talks about caste. It doesn't, they're linked together. Yeah. But the question is, what is caste? And one of the things that's been a big bugbear of mine for a long time is economists have kind of really mischaracterized what it is. And what it is, to begin with, is a theoretical set of constructs that go back literally thousands of years that are reflected in various texts, Hindu texts and Sanskrit texts, which divide society into hierarchical categories that are called varnas. Varna literally means color. And it's sometimes more complicated than this, but you have the Brahmins, who are the scholars and the priests. You have the Kshatriyas, who are the rulers and the warriors, the military people. The Vaishyas, who are the traders and the artisans. And the Shudras, who work on labor tasks, agricultural labor and so on. And then you have those outside the caste system. They were formerly called untouchables and other such categories, tribals, who don't really belong to the formal caste structure and are considered the lowest end of the caste system. And particularly the untouchables, as they were called in those days, then they have the social movement around their work, and led by the great B.R. Ambedkar, who wrote the Indian Constitution, was a Columbia-educated lawyer, and also had a PhD in economics, as it happens. He led a social movement for these groups, and they started calling themselves Dalits, and converted to Buddhism and so on to get outside the Indian caste system. But largely because of Ambedkar and because of the social movements around that, the government of India over the years has instituted a whole bunch of affirmative action programs to support and include and programs of inclusion for the former untouchables, who are now listed in a schedule, right? Listing the various untouchable castes, Dalit castes. So they're called scheduled castes, SC. And then similarly, you have the tribes, who are largely the forest dwellers living in forest areas and hill areas of India. Again, largely outside the caste system, again, relatively outside, normal patterns of economic development, who also benefit from various affirmative action programs. So they're called scheduled tribes, ST. And then you have the forward castes, who are people who are considered relatively well off. Backward castes, who are not scheduled castes but are pretty poor, and other backward castes who are backward castes but in another category. Now, so the government of India categorizes castes into these formal broad, what I call broad government categories. And getting included in one of these categories, other than the forward caste category, is a hugely political act now. I mean, it's constantly being contested. People are constantly saying, we need this, we are poor, we need... So those categories have changed over time. Who gets included has changed over time. And becoming very politicized. But the reason why economists get this wrong is that every large data set that is funded by the government of India, and there's an enormous amount of data the government of India produces, the national sample surveys, the Indian census, a whole bunch of stuff, restrict the availability of data to these broad categories of caste, right? So it's not the Varna categories or something else. It's these, are they scheduled castes, are they scheduled tribes, are they backward castes, are they other backward castes? Every data set that you see in India has these categories and nothing else. So our understanding of the broad patterns between the relationship between gender and caste, and I'm not talking about detailed ethnographic work by anthropologists, I'm talking about big picture stories, are always related to these broad caste categories. Now, the problem with this is that people don't live like this. I mean, they do live like this in the sense of wanting access to affirmative action programs, and so on and so forth. But caste is lived every day in villages and as Jati. Yeah? Jatis are endogamous groups. You marry within a Jati. Yeah? Of course, that endogamy has structures have changed with time, but still they're endogamous groups. And they are very specific to particular regions and particular linguistic parts of those regions. So you will have, Velalars in Tamil Nadu, you will have, Vakkaligas in Karnataka, you'll have Lingayats who are in Karnataka, but then have various subcastes. But then all over the country, you find these Jatis. Yeah? And there are hundreds of Jatis. Right? If you look at what I consider the most informed literature on caste in India, it's by the anthropologists going back at least to the 1920s. There's a whole huge literature. I've just cited a few things that look at this relationship between gender and caste. It's all about how Jatis and gender interact with each other. Yeah? Either tracking one Jati or Jatis within, or classic work of Andre Bate, looking at villages in Tamil Nadu, looking at the entire Jati structure of that village and how it works. The classic work of the great M.N. Srinivas, who's the doyen of Indian anthropologists, looking at Mysore villages in my state, as it happens, and tracking them in one village. Yeah? But if you look at that ethnographic literature, I mean, village studies, by definition, are small sample, right? There's one village you track, or maybe 5 at the most. And also, for some reason, maybe John can help tell us why, ethnographies seem to take a very, very long time to get published. Yeah? So when you collect the data, it's almost like 20 years before the stuff becomes a book or whatever. So this stuff actually is extraordinarily dated. Yeah? A thing published in 1995, I mean, I know Karen Kapadia's work, for instance, published in 1997. She did her field work in the early 80s, late 70s. Yeah? And it's brilliant work, but by the time it comes out, it's already out of date. Now, that doesn't mean diminish its importance. But what these things tell us is that these relationships between gender and gender relationships and patriarchy and Jati are extremely complex, extremely detailed, extremely finely honed to particular regions and particular linguistic groups. And then you can start understanding what goes on. Now, broadly speaking, the literature on gender and caste in India looks at the National Sample Survey data, looks at the IHFS data, what is that? NFHS data, sorry, the national, basically the DHS for India, or looks at the Indian census. And, there are several tropes that come out of this that, firstly, and this goes back to the great Esther Boserup, that low caste women have higher labor force participation rates than upper caste women. And there have been several people who've documented that afterwards. And of course, Boserup talked about a whole bunch of different things. This is one of the things she talked about. But she started that literature. And then there was all this literature that came out of that talking about why low caste women have greater labor force participation relating to the kind of work they do, and men's work and women's work in rural areas and fields and so on. The second thing is that lower castes have better female-male sex ratios. Yeah? And this goes back to Barbara Miller's work, Monica Dasgupta, Dresden Sen, again looking at caste categories as defined by the Indian census. Yeah? And more recently, Ashwini Deshpande, who's done several papers on this subject, has sort of said, yes, lower caste women have more labor force participation, but they are generally on other characteristics extremely deprived. So just because they have high labor force participation doesn't mean that they're better off. Again, looking at Indian census data and NSS data to make those patterns. But I'm just citing some of the literature. It's actually a very, very large literature. It's sort of where, when you think about caste and gender in India, this is where the understandings come from. Now, in the last, I guess, 2 decades or so, 15 years, there have been several pieces of work by economists looking at Jati, but these are very specific pieces of work and specific things. Yeah? And there's Kaiwan's several papers looking at these Jati networks and how they affect insurance and how they affect upward mobility and migration and so on and so forth. Very interesting, very important work, but doesn't tell us anything about Jatis as a large group, but they're looking at particular economic patterns within particular Jatis. There's work that I have done, and Guillaume here and others, looking at the politicization of Jatis and the political economy of Jatis and how they're affected by identity. But at least to our knowledge, nobody has looked at large-scale data sets with Jati information, trying to, like they did with big castes, trying to understand what are the patterns we understand from that. That's where we come in. Okay? So that's a contribution of our work. We're going to take samples, large samples, from rural India, from 3 big states. Bihar, which is one of India's poorest states, Odisha, which is also a poor state on the east coast, and Tamil Nadu in the south, which is a relatively better off state. And this data combines Jati categories with a good consumption module. So you have monthly consumption expenditures for the household and various indicators of women's labor force participation, inter-household decision-making, mobility, standard indicators of women's empowerment in one data set. And it's a very, very simple exercise. We're going to do a whole bunch of reduced form regressions to see how broadcast versus Jatis, what do we learn from each one of those sets of things. Okay? Now, I should mention some caveats. These surveys were done by me and my team over the last few years, starting in 2011, as baseline surveys for impact evaluations of women's livelihoods projects, which are anti-poverty projects focused on women. And these data sets, therefore, are representative of the poorer parts of these states, poorer rural parts of these states. So they cannot be generalized to the whole state. We don't have any urban data, for instance. It's all rural stuff, and that were poor areas, rural areas. So that's one caveat. The sampling is particular. And the second thing is that, in this particular paper, we're not trying very hard to make some grand tests of theories. We're trying to make a very basic point that Jati matters and trying to dump a whole bunch of stuff on you so that you will never look at a broadcast regression again and say that that explains everything. Okay? So that's the point of this exercise. It's literally an exercise in badgering, which I'm very good at. Okay. Now, what are the three states we're looking at? Bihar, Orissa, Tamil Nadu. These are not from our data set. These are sort of secondary data looking at broad macro aspects of these states. And you can see that in per capita GDP, Bihar is at the poor end, Tamil Nadu is at the high end, and Orissa is somewhere in the middle. They have pretty substantial scheduled caste populations, but Orissa particularly has a very large scheduled tribe population. A lot of variation in literacy, and all have pretty adverse sex ratios. Yeah, though of course Bihar, it's interesting, and Orissa is slightly better than the national average. Female literacy, and this is interesting. I'll come back in a second, and it's gotten a lot better. Orissa does a lot better than Bihar in female literacy. Tamil Nadu does the best, but Orissa is catching up real fast. This, by the way, is census data, so it's a little out of date now, and we'll show you what's happened to Orissa in a second. Again, we're looking at poorer blocks in poorer districts of these states, but still, it gives us a fair amount of district level. Districts are sub-state political entities, and you see that there's a fair amount of variation we have in each of these samples. So it is, it is taking a snapshot of a pretty large section of the state. And again, you find that scheduled castes are sort of oversampled, yeah, compared to the sample in the whole state population. And scheduled tribes, again, we're getting a fair amount in Orissa, but none in Tamil Nadu. And Tamil Nadu, you'll also see the absence of forward castes. And that's because, as it happens, there are not so many forward castes in Tamil Nadu in rural areas, because pretty much all castes have been defined into backward caste categories if they're not scheduled castes. Yeah? Because again, the politicization of these things. And whatever true forward castes exist are migrated to urban areas. So we don't pick them up in our sample. So it's a very particular sample. And I don't think it matters for us much because we're trying to make a broader point. Yeah. So, and the point we want to make is that our data still captures an enormous number of Jatis. Right? And these are Jatis, the ones that are mentioned by name are Jatis, which have at least, which are represented in at least 1% of the sample. If they're below 1% of the sample, we club them into an others category because, you can't do much with them. So scheduled caste and scheduled tribe others. But you can see, the two states I know relatively well are Tamil Nadu and Bihar. I don't know Orissa very well, I should admit. But at least you see that a whole variation of Jatis here. Huh? Okay. Summary statistics from our data, you'll see first of all that these data are quite recent. The samples are quite large. Per capita monthly expenditures, which we have data on, clearly are consistent with the state patterns that you saw earlier. Very low female household head, land holdings are very low. Female household heads are higher in Bihar and Tamil Nadu, which are higher migration states than in Orissa. Pretty big household size, as you might expect. And as I said, they're rural areas, so they're quite distant. This is in kilometers, average distance nearest town. And what is interesting here is you see that in Orissa, practically everybody goes to school. And that's what's interesting about our data, one of the interesting points about our data. Though, of course, in Bihar and Tamil Nadu, that's not the case. Yeah? Now, what about the women in our data? And, you know, not surprisingly, they sort of bang the median of the distribution. Low age at marriage, particularly in Bihar. Tamil Nadu is getting better. Almost everybody is married. And again, women in Orissa, practically all of them have attended some school, which to me actually was one of the very interesting things about this data, that it pointed this out in rural areas. Yeah? Okay. Characteristics of the female respondents again. Looking at purchase of, this is, you know, inter-household decision making, who has a say in various things. You see that Bihari women have a lot of say in purchase of household durables in Orissa and Tamil Nadu similarly, but politics, I mean, Orissa women basically vote for who the husbands tell them to vote for, not in Tamil Nadu by any means, and to some extent in Bihar. And mobility, physical mobility, are you able to go on your own without asking permission to a particular one of these, you know, major points of interest in the village? And you see that in Tamil Nadu, nobody asks anybody's permission. If any of you know Tamil women, that'll resonate with you. But in Bihar and in Orissa, it's much lower. More likely to go to the store, health center, everybody goes. Visit friend, neighbors, relatives, everybody goes. But to the office, government office, and to police stations, it's much lower. And that's only for Tamil Nadu, because these are 3 different surveys that were done for, as I said, to evaluate these livelihoods programs. So we had to contextualize them to each state. All right. So what we're doing here, as I said, is a very simple set of exercises. We're going to have a whole bunch of outcomes: female labor force participation, measures of inter-household decision-making, and female physical mobility. We're controlling for everything we can manage to control for, including panchayat-level fixed effects. So panchayat is really the political entity that governs villages, village democracies, and those include between 1 to 3 villages in each state, depending on the state. So, you know, we have those fixed effects. So stuff you're seeing is within those village democracies. And, you know, let me just move on, and let's start with the first set of regressions. The first thing I'm going to do is to run the standard model on these data with the broad government caste categories. To simply point, I'm going to do it state by state. So you can see, you can see that the patterns are broadly consistent with the rest of the literature. The omitted category here is scheduled castes. You'll see that forward castes and other backward castes in the state of, I want to go to Bihar first, sorry. Other backward castes and extremely backward castes, which is another category in Bihar, all have lower rates of, slightly lower rates, between 10 and 8 to 9%, 8 to 10% of lower labor force participation than scheduled castes. Muslims also have lower labor force participation, and general castes, which are upper castes, have much lower labor force participation. And you can see, I'm not going to focus so much on these other variables. We can talk about them if you're interested. I want to focus on the caste stuff, yeah? But we're controlling for all that. Now, what you can also see, again, consistent with the literature here, is that at least on, do you have a say in whether the woman gets to work or not? All these upper castes compared to the scheduled castes have less say. They also have less mobility than the scheduled castes, right? So broadly speaking, these patterns are consistent with the tropes that exist about caste in India on the basis of, say, NSS or census analysis. Similarly, in Orissa, where the broad caste categories are different because it goes state by state, you see that pretty much both forward castes and other backward castes have less labor force participation, but scheduled tribes, again, consistent with the census literature, have much higher labor force participation than scheduled castes. That's actually a well-known fact. Yeah? And again, with whatever gets picked up in these livelihood and mobility things, it's largely negative compared to scheduled castes. Right? So let's go to Tamil Nadu next. Tamil Nadu, again on employment, you see the same thing. You see less variation for decision-making and mobility, and you know, but what you see is also negative. Yeah? So bottom line from the analysis of broad caste categories, it's consistent with the rest of the literature. So our data are not weird, right? Our data are not weird. No, yeah, they're not. All right. So next thing we're going to do is sort of do what you might call a Bose-Ropian exercise, but I don't want to call it all that. All we're doing is looking at within caste heterogeneity by monthly expenditure. So the idea being that when households get better off, does it affect women's empowerment or labor force participation? So we're interacting these caste dummies with monthly per capita expenditure. And you see that scheduled tribes, I mean, of course, employment is endogenous to monthly expenditures, but we're not trying to make a causal claim here, we're just looking at associations. So please don't come to me with the usual economics questions. This is a descriptive exercise. But what is interesting is that scheduled tribes, as those families get better off, women work more, right? So that, and this is Bihar, that stuff is feeding back. We're controlling for the same things. I'm not reporting all the other controls, but you know what they are. And similarly, with forward castes, the highest castes, as they get, not similarly, quite the opposite, as the households get better off, women work less, which is consistent with a backward-bending labor supply curve for women. Okay, I don't have to go anywhere else. There might be some of you thinking Sanskritization, this, please don't go there. Yeah, I'm not testing for any of that stuff. Just think simple women's labor supply is not a normal good. That's it. So you don't need anything else. Yeah. Orissa, similarly, both scheduled tribes, not similarly, but interestingly, scheduled tribes and other backward castes, as they get better off, work less, women work less. And Tamil Nadu, you have no effect. And notice that there is no variation at all in any of the other variables. So there's no heterogeneity within these castes, broad caste categories, when you interact with expenditures and anything else. Okay? So you walk away from this. If this is what you do, if you look at census data, you'd say, yes, scheduled castes work more, women work more than forward castes and other backward castes, but they work less than scheduled tribes. They tend to have more say in, more empowerment, largely, yeah, than other folks, more upper castes. And we know that's true about India. All right. So now we go into the Jati level analysis. We're kind of doing the same thing, but for Jatis. And of course, we have many more Jatis when you have broad government caste categories. So forgive me, you're going to see a lot of tables. And we're going to go state by state. So the way these tables are organized, we're in the first set of regressions, which is the two sets of regressions here. This is one, this is one. We're controlling for all the controls you saw, but we are excluding from this any household that is not a scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe. They're the omitted category. And the dummies we're including are Jatis for scheduled castes and tribes. Okay, is that clear? Yeah, so we're comparing scheduled caste Jatis to everybody else, right? That's what we're doing here. Here we're doing exactly the opposite. We're excluding scheduled castes. We're including Jati dummies for the other backward castes and the forward castes. Yeah? So you can see things get a hell of a lot more interesting, even if I say so myself. Look at these coefficients. These are all scheduled castes in Bihar. This is all Bihar. Yeah? Look at this. Look at the variation there. For instance, compare the Mushahars, who are here, to the Sardars, who are here. Sardars are no different from forward castes, but Mushahars work a lot more. Mushahar women work a lot more. Mushahar women work a lot more than Dushads and then Dobhas, but Chamars are pretty close to Mushahar women, right? You start asking these very, very specific Jati level questions. Why is it that Mushahar's women work more? Why is it that Chamar women work more, but the Sardars are no different? I have answers to those questions because I'm a little bit Bihar. Mushahars are extremely poor communities. They tend to be segregated from the rest of the village. The women tend to work in menial jobs and they work with the men. I mean, you go to any Bihari village, you'll see that I'm right, right? The Sardars are relatively well off, even though they schedule castes. Yeah, they're politically more powerful. Let's look at decision-making variables. And here again, you get stuff picked up in tuition, input into tuition and livelihoods, and something on politics. You see again, just looking at the significant stuff, because the rest we don't estimate very precisely, you see there's a lot of variation. Yeah? Mobility, yes, scheduled castes are more mobile, but not the Dobas compared to forward castes. Chamars, yes, much more than Mushahars, but you know, not the Sardars. So in many ways, the Sardars are not very different than the non-scheduled castes. Yeah? Let's go to the other Jatis. That is, we're going now away from the scheduled castes to the forward castes. And look at this. The Kurmis, by the way, the chief minister of Bihar right now is a Kurmi. The Kurmis are goat herds by traditional profession. Compared to scheduled castes, work less. Yadavs work less, but not, well, about 8% less, 9% less. But look at the Brahmins and the Rajputs. They work, these are the big guys, right? These guys work a lot less. 33% less for Brahmin women, 21% less for Rajput women. And then also look, Brahmins work a lot less than Rajputs. We change our picture of how the forward castes operate. We don't know this stuff from most data sets. Yeah? Look at, on durables, it's absolutely no different than, from each other. On input into tuition, nothing. Into livelihoods, all of them have less input into livelihoods. But again, compare the Brahmin and the Rajput coefficients here to everybody else. This is real forward caste stuff. Yeah? Mobility, everybody is less mobile in these forward castes, but not the Kurmis or the Dhanuks. Kurmis are goat herds. You go out and take your goats, and you have to go to the fields to get them to feed. So you're not going to be very different. Women do it as well as men do. But the Yadavs and the Brahmins and the Rajputs really don't like the women going out, which, if you know anything about Rajputs, is completely consistent with what you know. Yeah? Not much variation anywhere else. That's Bihar. Let's go to Orissa. I mean, you sort of get the point of the paper very quickly, right? The Baruis, again, doing SCs at the top, the other Jatis at the bottom, the Barui Jati is much, much more likely to work than anybody else, as are the others categories, and the Keotas. But look at the scheduled tribes. They work the most. We are not able to do Jati level analysis of the scheduled tribes because there's so many Jatis and scheduled tribes that none of them were above 1%. Yeah? So scheduled tribes has to be kept in a broad way. Input into durables, not much stuff going on here except with Keotas and others. Mobility, there's absolutely no difference. There's practically no difference than forward castes, yeah, on anybody. Other Jatis, again, compare the Brahmins. The Brahmins are really the ones who really like their women to stay at home. But so do the Karans and the Kandhayats and the Goalas. But everybody else, the Tantis, the Gurias, the Telis being oil pressers, are all quite similar to scheduled castes. Yeah? So, and there's really not much variation in anything else. Tamil Nadu. Let's start with the scheduled castes. You see that the Adi Dravidars work more, and they are kind of the poorest of the scheduled castes. And they tend to have a little more input into tuition decisions and into mobility aspects than compared to the other castes, but not much variation anywhere else. So scheduled castes in Tamil Nadu, even though you saw it in the broad caste category regressions, most of that is because of Adi Dravidars. It's not driven by anybody else, except scheduled tribes a little bit. Yeah? Most of this is coming from Adi Dravidars. It's not for all Jatis in the scheduled caste category. In forward castes, you see the Velalars work less than scheduled castes, and the Naidus work a little less than scheduled castes. But other than that, not much going on. Yeah? Again, I mean, you can make some sort of assertions that this may be because Tamil Nadu is a better off state and so on. We don't have the data to prove that one way or another. Point I want to make is that when you start seeing at the Jati level, questions start coming up. Why is that greater than this? Why is this greater than this? To understand those things, you better understand how Jatis work in each of these states. Now, what we're going to do is to interact those Jatis, as we did in the broadcast categories, with expenditures. Look at the heterogeneity there. And that's where you see some action picking up. Chamars, as they get better off, are less likely to have their women work. Mushahars to some extent, but not the Sardars or the others, or the Dobhas. And really not much stuff going on anywhere else. Other Jatis, you see the Brahmins really don't like the women to work, and as they get better off, they really keep them at home more. So do the others. And the Brahmins, as they get better off, give their women less say into employment because they don't let them work anyway. And they don't let their women go out, as do the Rajputs. So again, there is an aspect here of some flavor of as these very forward castes, Brahmins and Rajputs, in the state of Bihar get better off economically, they start restricting their women more. Yeah? But not anybody else. Orissa, not much variation at the expenditure level. We didn't set the broadcast categories either. So there's really not much to say, not much patterns to make here. Yeah? Expenditure variation doesn't seem to matter here. So Bosrope doesn't matter in Orissa. Yeah? And she doesn't matter in Tamil Nadu either. Yeah? And in fact, there's not much variation by expenditure here either, yeah, as we saw. But Bihar, it does matter. Okay, so let me take a break here and tell you that think about what we've done. I mean, it's a very, very simple exercise, almost mindless, but it requires a certain kind of data which we happen to have. And what you see from that is that the misleading claims that are made by looking at Indian government data, census data, NSS data, on the nature of caste and its relationship to women, have to be thought through much more carefully at the Jati level, because there's a lot of variation there. And it varies from state to state. And in fact, I bet you, and I've done this in other papers, if you go down to the village level, you see a lot more variation, right? Because those Jatis start mattering more the lower you get. It's sort of a fractal, they matter fractally, if you use a coinous phrase, yeah? What I'm next going to do, and let me explain what's going on here. You know, remember when you're running dummy variables, you're always excluding something and comparing others to that. What we're doing here, and you can say that, well, that's because you excluded the one thing, yeah? But what we're doing here, we're comparing pairwise all the combinations possible for each Jati. We're trying to see if they're significantly different from each other. That is, do Jatis matter? That's the do Jatis matter table, right? Each coefficient is compared to see if it's significantly different from each other. Now, of course, we get a whole bunch of things because you think of all the combinations of all the Jatis that we have. So what we do is that we divide up in the denominator those that are significantly different from each other by the total number. And you can see here that in Bihar and scheduled caste Jatis, 43% of them are significantly different from each other. 14.3% of non-SC Jatis are significantly different from each other. Input in intra-household decision-making, 25% and 26%. In mobility, 24% and 14%. In Orissa, hugely, what's that word? Big league, sorry. 62% of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe Jatis are different from each other in their employment. 31% of non-scheduled caste Jatis. Similarly, intra-household decision-making. Tamil Nadu, it's lower, but still pretty big. Yeah? So, what we've done here again, pairwise comparisons of Jati level coefficients. Jatis are different, bottom line, on gender issues. Conclusion. Focusing on government-defined broad caste categories can hide, many details in the lived reality of caste. Caste is not lived in these are government categories. They're lived to the extent that they're political categories, so you live them. We're all political beings, particularly in a democratic setting. But in the way we live these things in everyday village life and rural life, it's the Jati that matters. And that hides a lot when you look in broadcast. It requires information of Jati identity. And even in this sample with all its limitations, in these three samples with all their limitations, we find that this is true for both upper and lower castes. And there are important and interesting differences between Jatis. And there are also some there's more heterogeneity by expenditure by Jati than there is for broadcasts. Yeah? And we've just thrown a lot of stuff out. It's going to take an enormous amount of work to figure out what's exactly going on with each of these things. But that should be the research agenda. Because otherwise, what happens is you're doing mistargeting. You're targeting with these broadcast categories, when in fact there's a lot of variance within those broadcast categories, within scheduled caste, for instance. Yeah? They're much poorer folks, much better off folks, much more empowered women, much less empowered women. And understanding that, this is a huge exercise. Yeah? We've just thrown something out. And it really, really affects the nature of policy interventions. And every policy intervention is targeted by broad caste categories, EBCs and OBCs and scheduled castes. Yeah? And people think that that's enough. But what you're doing with that is that you're missing out the truly disadvantaged, to use William Julius Wilson's famous term, or the better off. Yeah? Thank you.